This paper concerns consequences of my solution to the hard problem of consciousness, presented in The Self is Brain and a Solution to the Body-Mind Problem. For neuroscientists, a solution to the hard problem could be likened to the Holy Grail, and researchers and AI would immediately try to program it into conscious computers. In my opinion, seekers of Holy Grails risk being told in the end, I fought in your general direction, your mother was a hamster, and your father smelt elderberries. In this paper, I will examine the different proposals that have been put forward for simulating consciousness and demonstrate what is wrong with them. We are fated to remain ignorant of the mechanism of emergent properties such as consciousness. The reason can be traced to a contradiction in the behavior of information respecting the first two laws of thermodynamics. Information, considered as the microstate of the particles within an isolated system's macrostate, can, like first law energy, neither be destroyed nor created. Yet the information in that system, like second law entropy, will inevitably increase. For routine events, Laplace's all-knowing demon can increase the amount of information without creating it through its foreknowledge of where every particle in the system is destined to go. This does not work for emergent events, which, by definition, are features of a system which cannot be predicted by a complete understanding of the underlying level of composition. I consider these events to be irreversible computations, subject to Landauer's principle. Bits of information temporarily stored during the computation must then be destroyed, representing work and an increase of entropy. I propose that the increase in entropy in a time-irreversible, unpredictable, isolated system requires the simultaneous permanent deletion of information concerning the steps or computations involved. Therefore, steps leading to consciousness are destroyed by entropy and will never be understood. This is good news for anyone who prefers to believe that reality exists more or less as it is presented to us through our senses, even as we acknowledge that we do not see the same floral colors as does a bee, or sniff the same smells as a dog, or experience the world through sonar. Although no two individuals' experience of the world is identical, we are happy to suppose that we are indeed all sharing an experience of the same physically real universe. Nonetheless, certain prominent theorists have proposed that the odds are so much against the reality of our existence that we almost certainly exist as simulations in a future computer program. Worse still, cosmologists insist that the terminal universe will accommodate the formation of an infinite number of so-called Boltzmann's brains floating at the edge of the heat death of thermal equilibrium to imagine our existence. How can we sleep at night if we fear that our Boltzmann's brain may drift apart as randomly as it assembled before we wake up in the morning? So I am here to save the day, or at least the reality of our existence. In 2022, David Chalmers published Reality Plus, building on a proposal of Nick Bostrom to suggest that we are probably simulants in a future conscious computer, and that this would pose no problem for the meaning or relevance of our lives. The simulations can be classed as those imposed on the brains of our pre-existing bodies, called biosims, and those programmed into a computer in the absence of our ever having had corporeal forms at all, Puresims. In part one of this program, I will demonstrate that we cannot be biosims, such as depicted in the Matrix series of movies. Consider the potential future of a sophisticated virtual reality, or VR. Put on a headset to enter a perceptual world of sights and sounds prepared by a computer programmer set anywhere and anytime in the past, present, or future. It might even one day incorporate senses of smell and touch. You could see your arms and legs move through the scenario, though grasped objects would lack solidity and walls could be penetrated. There could be imaginary people who could talk and answer questions, chat box style. Interactive programs allow several users to present themselves as cartoonish avatars, able to talk to each other as voiceovers through the headset. But no VR headset would be able to feed or hydrate a participant who consumes virtual food or drink, nor could it maneuver a subject in a manner consistent with toilet hygiene. The maximum a VR could do would be a scenario one could share with friends for a limited time, holding conversations you would all remember afterwards. A mind-reading program could avoid the voiceover effect and adapt the scenario in real time to follow the conversation appropriately. A person dying in the VR would cease to cause their avatar to respond to others. No matter how sophisticated the VR, users would always be aware that their experience was coming from a headset. Augmented reality consists of headsets or eyeglasses that project images or text into our field of view. Chalmers claims that if an AR projects a virtual piano in Washington Square, and it is perceived as virtual by the AR users and not illusory, then it is not illusory. Augmented reality is genuine reality. This is the unacceptable relativism of alternate facts. If the AR was programmed to show users that I was vandalizing the piano and they called the police, I would need to prove that the AR was in fact an illusion. Agreeing, Chalmers writes, the relativity of multiple realities does not yield an escape from the cold hard facts about ordinary reality. But this may be less obvious when AR tech can be installed as brain implants. To live full-time in VR, we would need a matrix-like pod able to feed and hydrate us and eliminate our waste. Chalmers was a consultant on the movie series. If the VR could change memories, we wouldn't realize where we were. Reproduction would be tricky. Artificial ejaculation and insemination in the pods, followed by the pod makers rearing the child. Chalmers notes, in childhood especially, exposure to the physical environment may be required for the normal development of the body and brain. In fact, Held and Hines' classic kitten in a basket experiment showed that rearing kittens with one suspended from a carousel, that one failed to develop depth perception, but not the harnessed kitten, which drove the carousel. Plus, lack of exercise would cause bodily harms that couldn't be obviated by electrical stimulations. Despite this, Chalmers believes that one's body could be kept healthy at least. Chalmers argues that leading an immersive, false life, free from real responsibilities, would be an ethically good life, writing, in a full-scale VR, users would build their own lives as they choose, genuinely interacting with others around them and leading a meaningful and valuable life. Virtual reality need not be second-class reality. Spending most of our lives there would be a reasonable choice, and in the future, VR will be a safe haven free from the degraded state of the planet, to which one might occasionally return, but only as a fetish or a novelty. A full-time commitment, knowingly or not, to VR creates a world of problems. You would need to trust the programmer, who could subject you to torture, and you may not even realize it is virtual. The programmer could even inflict a coronavirus pandemic on everyone as a sick joke. Really? That happened to you? In a shared VR, if A shoots B, we would have to be disconnected from the program, or appear to be immortal. But if it knows participants won't return to reality, where they could compare notes, then it wouldn't have to mind read or transmit real speech to other participants. This would be a pseudo-solipsism, a solipsism with a material basis, leaving you alone with your thoughts and the program. At the end of your life, no one would notice. The VR computer, the programmer, and the pods would need costly maintenance. Who would do it, or pay for it, and why? Participants in committed VR couldn't earn real money unless a composer, writer, or financial advisor could produce ideas extracted by the program to market in the real world. If there were no buyers, then it's termination time. The lack of incentive makes it highly unlikely some organization would go to the trouble of putting us in pods. Chalmers suggests it to be financed out of universal basic income, since no one is needed for jobs anyway. Corporations could drive immersive VR as a way to hide oppressive wealth disparity, though I doubt we could trust corporations to provide us with a benign happy place out of the beneficence of their corporate hearts. From the perspective of the inhabitant, life in a pod would be indistinguishable from being a brain in a vat. Perhaps the brains of the dying could be kept alive in this way. Perhaps the vatted brain could communicate with people through its wiring, or on a brain farm, many vats will be interconnected. But as in the case of pod VR, vatted brains may be kept as pseudo-solipsisms. For VR life in a vat, only the maintenance requirements would differ from life in a pod battery. VR can also be applied to our bodily existence through implantation of computer chips into our brain, or as nanobots in our bloodstream. Chips that interface between brains and AI are already in advanced development and have been used medically to rehabilitate stroke victims. The ethics of brain-cloud interfaces is subject to intense debate. Ray Kurzweil hopes to merge his neocortex to a cloud-based AI by 2045. Chalmers predicts it will be as easy as linking two computers. However, as a result of the negative entropy and entropy debt associated with consciousness, a computerized cloud-based version of our brain will have no more consciousness than the data on an old floppy disk. Ray Kurzweil predicts cheap nanobots could easily be infiltrated into our bloodstreams, communicating with an external supercomputer to supply us with limitless knowledge and memory, like an internal internet. But they could also commandeer our thoughts, produce a VR, and allow the supercomputer to control us. Evidence suggests they could create a highly contagious mass mental illness and addiction to blatantly fake news. But their reliance on an external, non-conscious supercomputer may protect our entropy-driven conscious decision-making from being breached, and our own nervous system should still be able to provide a competing view of reality. This suggests that nanobots couldn't make the human condition much worse than Facebook already has, if that's any consolation. And once we die, we cease to participate. As opposed to an AI capable of modifying the consciousness of living organisms, Puresims are conscious entities that have no other existence than that of the binary code in the algorithmic world of a computer. Philosopher Nick Bostrom proposed that we are most likely to be Puresims, since in the future, or present on another planet, generation after generation of owners of cheap conscious computers could run simulations of our historical or some imaginary planet and populate it with an unlimited number of simulated people who could, it is proposed, possess consciousness within the simulation. It follows that the vast majority of conscious minds in the universe may be these simulants, or sims, and our universe may exist in some teenager's contact lens. One of the following three propositions must be correct. 1. Almost zero civilizations are likely to survive long enough to create simulated worlds. 2. Almost no long-lived civilizations are likely to wish to run such a program. Or 3. The fraction of all people with our type conscious experience that are sims is close to 1. Add the people who live and die over the next million years after such tech is developed, plus the number of similar techs elsewhere in the universe, and reason that each such entity may program 1 or 2 sim worlds, each with 1 billion inhabitants or more, then there could be trillions of simulated conscious beings in the future, thinking that they live on present-day Earth. With only 8 billion humans thought to exist on Earth today versus trillions who think that's what they are, the odds are enormous favoring that we are a sim. Chalmers argues that even if we knew we were bits in an algorithm, our lives would still be perfectly real, meeting the 5 criteria of being genuine, non-illusory, mind-independent, causal, existing things. That seems a stretch, but he invokes structuralism, the idea that theories in physics can be reduced to their mathematical and observational implications. If the mathematical structure of atomic physics is present in the real world, then atomic physics is true and atoms exist. Defining atoms by their mathematical role and observational connections, then atoms are whatever it is that is fulfilling that role. And in the digital simulation, digital entities would fulfill that role, and therefore the theory that atoms would be digital bits would be true. Chalmers admits we can deny that atoms are digital entities by denying structuralism insisting that atoms require both mathematical structure and physical substrate. I'd add also, the physical substrate could be based on string theory or loop quantum gravity, and that a structuralist, like a relativist or a pragmatist, would fail to distinguish between the possibilities, and then that these possibilities could lead to important practical consequences. By claiming that a theory can be known to be true, structuralism fails to meet the scientific standard of being falsifiable, and is therefore incapable of being improved upon through scientific inquiry. The sim world we supposedly inhabit could create a vast range of structure from photons to galactic clusters, and could evidently grant a stream of consciousness to me. But it is no reason to suppose that we should go to the extravagant, or it would go to the extravagant expense of creating consciousness for 8 billion people on Earth, or indeed anyone besides myself. In a biological world, we assume that everyone is really conscious due to our shared genetic heritage, but in a sim world, everyone else is more likely to be a philosophical zombie. This being so, there would be no moral reason why we shouldn't take a machine gun to the supermarket for target practice. As far as we could tell, living in a sim world would be identical to a true solipsism. Chalmers doesn't explain the role of free will in simulated programs, though he suggests it could be present in VR. Perhaps I could choose to commit mass murder if the program was flexible enough to reconfigure everything afterwards. Perhaps it has already decided whether I will commit the murder, even forcing me to do so against my will, for which I could be severely punished or even killed. Either way, it would have to be determined by the program. When we die in the sim world, the program could switch us off, or switch off entirely, or ferry us into some sort of afterlife. No problem, a dead sim would be composed of the same binary coding as a live sim. But if the computer's power source ever failed, the sim's life would end in a snap. Chalmers supposes it too expensive to maintain dead sims, though superb specimens may be recycled or even incarnated in the sim designer's own world. You would have to take it on faith that the designer wasn't also a sim, and that the universe wasn't simulations all the way up. He speculates that a digital immortality would be considered a blessing if it were available. Chalmers assumes an unlimited cheap energy supply to drive all these computations, which at present cost about $25,000 per quantum computer per year. Throughout history, energy supply has been a rate-limiting factor on the satisfaction of our desires, either in the gaining of it or in the pollution accompanying its consumption. But even if we could afford and desire to create a universal algorithm, no program would be under any pressure, evolutionary or otherwise, to generate consciousness, no matter how many trillions of times it was operated, and indeed entropy would not favor it to do so. It could only do so if specifically programmed. Because consciousness is an emergent phenomenon, we'll never know how it emerges or how to program it into a computer. This follows from a recently theorized principle of entropy, according to which the generation of a time-irreversible, unpredictable leap to an emergent level of organization, i.e. consciousness, would require knowledge of calculations that are continuously destroyed as a result of the entropy of that emergent process. Not knowing how the leap occurs, we can never program it into a computer. This theory is an example of what Chalmers calls a sim blocker, an insurmountable objection to Bostrom's third proposition. The entropic theory of consciousness asserts we'll never program consciousness into a computer. It can only arise through evolution in living, dying creatures to facilitate successful sexual reproduction, which dramatically increases the diversity possible in the world compared to a world restricted to asexually reproducing organisms. Even if a computer accidentally stumbled across the secret combination to consciousness, it could only persist if it increased entropy for it to happen. Unless it could solve a problem not solvable otherwise, expanding the idea sphere by solving problems no one thought to ask of it, then somehow communicating those solutions back to the non-conscious printer, the computer could not affect the world's entropy. In order to gain consciousness, computers would have to evolve into living organisms needing to sexually reproduce before they die. They would have to fall in love and be prepared to die to protect their baby. At this point, AI would no longer be artificial. Chalmers writes, if we could prove that simulated beings couldn't be conscious, we could prove that we are not simulated beings. It's just as well, because otherwise the probability of our being a simulant would be infinitesimal compared to the odds that you or I are Boltzmann's brains. These are random accumulations of subatomic particles that drift in and out of existence during the heat death of the universe, and every few trillion years or so may temporarily assemble into a functional brain. Assuming the infinite duration of this final phase of the universe, this will happen an infinite number of times. These could provide us with the illusion of living the same real life we currently believe we are living, when in fact there is nothing else. Chalmers accepts that their beliefs about the universe are almost all false, but that it couldn't deny the existence of the external world. But this existence would be a pseudo-solipsism from which we could not escape by natural death, except that we would die when the brain disintegrates. Chalmers cites Sean Carroll's cognitively unstable argument that one can't accept the truth of the notion of being a Boltzmann's brain without accepting that one's perception of the outside world, including the physics that led to the prediction of the brains, is an illusion. Thus, the brains can't exist. This circular reasoning says that if physics exists, Boltzmann's brains are a consequence, but if they exist, physics doesn't. We are saved by the fact that simply assembling by chance the atoms of a brain does not make it conscious. There would be no evolutionary purpose to its being conscious, and no way for it to pay an entropy debt. Though Boltzmann's brains can in the future exist, they can't be conscious, and therefore we are not Boltzmann's brains. In this paper, I have put forward several arguments to counter the proposal by David Chalmers that if we lived in a simulated world, we would be morally and existentially satisfied with that. But in any case, the points are moot. The second law of thermodynamics forbids consciousness to anything that would be unable to repay an entropy debt accrued from the benefits that consciousness confers. Furthermore, a new principle of thermodynamics prevents consciousness from arising other than in an organic evolutionary situation. This restricts consciousness to living organisms. Consciousness in computers is impossible. This article and several related articles of philosophical interest can be found on my website, scholarshipoffoolsphilosophy.com. There you will also find contact information should you have questions or comments concerning this presentation. Thank you for your attention, and please encourage others to view this video.